Morning. What an honor to be able to kick off this exciting day for you. That's not me, that's James Beard. When Naz and I discussed how I might get us going today, inspire the rest of the day, as we're all going to be inspired by today's speakers, I kept coming back to the idea of exploring the concept of American food itself. Because having spent 23 years at the James Beard Foundation, the last 6 years as a regional chair of the World's 50 Best Restaurant Program, and last year in particular as the Chief Creative Officer of the USA Pavilion at Expo Milano, which was a World's Fair dedicated to food, I've done a lot of thinking about what American food is and what it means. And I think that I've seen, to my surprise, its impact around the world. And even though I think it's really difficult to define for reasons that we'll talk about, I think it's an important concept for us to have at our fingertips. But before I begin speaking about American food, I actually want to take a step back, and I want us to think about a more fundamental question: what is food? Now, I know it's a silly question, but I think we take it for granted when people talk about food that we're talking about the same thing. And we really, really rarely ever make the effort to change that or to figure out what we mean. Because it's not helpful to say that food is anything that's edible. Turns out there's maybe 50,000 or more plants on Earth that are edible. Of those, only 3,000 of them are regularly consumed as food. And of those 3,000, 3 of them, just 3, provide 60% of all of the calories we eat. So something else is going on. My guess is that most of you recognize this as food. These are some different plants, more than those 3, which are rice, wheat, and corn, by the way. Obviously, this is a picture at the Green Market, where some of you probably think that the best food on Earth comes. Chances are many of those same people look at this cereal aisle and think, well, that's not food. Of course, the reality is that more people eat this kind of food than eat the food at the Green Market. And on a personal note, my husband, who's a palliative care physician, wanted me to promise that I wouldn't malign Fruit Loops in this talk. Okay, so yes, Nate, Fruit Loops are food too. This is also food. It's a beautiful sardine dish prepared by the very young, very talented chef Flynn McGarry, who you'll hear from later today. Actually, Naz and I, one of those meals we had was at Flynn's pop-up restaurant, where she plumbed my brain for questions. But although we may long for this type of food, an elegant, carefully prepared, expensive restaurant meal, the irony is it's probably the type of food that the fewest people in the world will ever have an opportunity to eat. By contrast, this is the food that more people will have to eat and will recognize and consume. Fast food, obviously, but I'd like to note that fast food's a term I resent because every culture throughout history has had some way to feed itself quickly. The ancient city of Pompeii had takeout shops already, and we're talking before Christ. So to say that Americans invented fast food, I think, is wrong. And in fact, sometimes I think that we should call it more what it is. I'd suggest global, efficient, time-motion, capitalist, real estate-driven marketing food. But that's a mouthful. Anyway. People the world over love hamburgers and French fries. They associate them with Americans. We know because in Milan we sold 500,000 of them, 500,000 hamburgers to the 6.5 million people who came through our pavilion. And partly I think they associate them with us because they stand for youth and progress and modernity. And people love to consume that. There's even a burger craze happening right now in Milan. This is food too. Soylent, and the people who brought us Soylent are going to be here, going to address you later today, if they aren't in the audience already. Of course, what makes this food isn't the earth or the farmer that it came from, but the nutrition it contains, also the innovation it represents, the ideas of progress and modernity it stands for, not unlike those hamburgers. Maybe this is the fast food of the future. Not unlike Soylent, this is food too. If there are any health professionals in the audience, this is TPN, total parenteral nutrition. That comes from my husband, by the way. Another form of complete nutrition that's given to the sickest people directly into their stomachs, bypassing the taste buds, bypassing the fun and the cultural experience of food, but food nonetheless, life-sustaining food. I could go on, but I think my point is clear here. Food isn't just any one thing, it's many things, and the context and the culture in which it is consumed is as important as what is consumed itself. So this is a good time to introduce, or reintroduce for some of you, Claude Lévi-Strauss, the great French anthropologist, whose culinary triangle so elegantly showed the world how things that are edible become food, not just by cooking them, but by thinking them. Food is good to think, was his most famous line. However, nature is transformed by culture, from raw to cooked to rotten, as it's shown in this triangle. That is to say that culture, like salt, is a key ingredient in what we eat. Another culturally constructed system, really, that helps us understand what food is, and one that's probably more keyed to America and to this particular time, is the food system. You can draw it many ways. This one was done by Wholesome Wave, which is a great organization founded by Michel Nichon, a chef who is bringing low-cost, high-quality food to people around the country. But this food system diagram shows us, however you draw it, really, how we produce, process, distribute, consume, and dispose of our food in some way. We can debate how we do it and the value we put on one or the other, or the laws we write, but ultimately our food must pass through these stages or stations on its way to being eaten and beyond. In fact, I'd suggest that these points in the system turn edible things into food, much like Levi-Strauss's culture cooks them. If we take the concepts of food and then try to categorize them or qualify them by asking ourselves a more important question, what is American food? Things get even messier, honestly. Because certainly this is American food, as we know, and this is American food, if only because it was grown on American soil. This is American food cooked by an American chef. Even this is American food, or maybe an American idea of food. But then there's Boston baked beans, of course. Can't deny those are American. Macaroni and cheese. My husband would kill me if I said that wasn't food. But so is a Chinese banquet American food, or a Mexican feast, or an Indian meal, or especially an Italian-American dinner. And you know that because the meatballs are on the spaghetti and the stars and stripes are on the wall. My point, obviously, is the sheer variety of food available to us in America is in a place where our culture is made up of, and until only recently in our political process, celebrated for its immigrant influences. It makes defining what American food is very difficult. And without a definition, it's hard to put your finger on it elsewhere in the world, and yet you find it, I find it, wherever I go. And I'm just going to take a sidestep, because if you think that this diversity of food is something new to American food, I want to show a few historical things to you. As early as 1870, when this picture of a Chinese restaurant on DuPont Street in San Francisco was taken, San Francisco was known as a city of multiple diverse restaurants, second only to Paris in the world, at least according to Alexandre Dumas, who is the French author who actually also, in addition to the novels that he wrote a gastronomic dictionary, Dictionnaire de la Cuisine. And then I love this New Yorker cover from April 2nd, 1938, which lists all the varieties of ethnic foods available in New York City at that time. You can't read them, but there's 50 on the side. And they include things like miso shiro, risotto milanese, obviously kosher varnishkas, but also char siu, teriyaki. This is 1938 already, New York poking fun of itself and the diversity of food here. So with all these international influences to consider when we're trying to define American food, especially in a situation like we had in Milan, where we brought chefs from all over the United States to cook, and they cooked Mexican meals and Italian meals and French meals and everything in between, it's important for us to spend some time, I think, thinking about cuisine. A little bit different from food, actually a lot different. Because it's actually cuisine, more than food, that travels around the world, that brings bits of national identity and culture with it. Cuisine defines and then crosses national borders, and I'll show you how a little bit later. The notion of cuisine is particularly suited to French food, because it is a product of French culture, a culture that has always liked to codify and record things, and keep them the same even. The Académie Française tries to tell people what words they can use and what words they can't use. We don't have an Académie Anglaise. But let's not forget that the French gave us the encyclopedias of the natural and philosophical world in 1751, where they literally tried to put the entire world into volumes of a book and find some order in it. So what is French cuisine? I don't know if you recognize these, but this is a forgotten hallmark of early haute cuisine française. These are the pièces montées and the socles of the royal 19th century tables. More than 250 years old, they look to me like things you see in Paris today, the ironwork on the buildings and the La Croix dresses on French women. They were the product of this guy, Marie-Antoine Carême, known as the Chef of Kings and the King of Chefs, who was credited, believe it or not, by simplifying and systematizing and defining French haute cuisine. 80 years after Carême, this book appeared, Le Guide Culinaire by Georges-Auguste Escoffier, this guy, who wrote it in 1903, towards the middle to end of his career, after thinking about French food, working with French chefs, spreading French cuisine around the world. And he wrote in his memoir, I think this is particularly interesting, that in addition to improving the lives of chefs, my proudest achievement was planting more than 2,000 French chefs in kitchens around the world to establish French ingredients and French cuisine as the dominant culinary form which we know lasted for centuries. Based on Escoffier's and Carême's work and the work of their colleagues, France gave us a model of cuisine, neatly ordered and understandable as a system of dishes that related to each other and to the regions and terroir of France. There was an internal logic to the system, not unlike the way Lévi-Strauss found an internal logic to the cultural system of food and cooking. This is a diagram of the 5 mother sauces of French cuisine proposed by Carême and codified by Escoffier, all neat and tidy. You'll note there are many global influences. You probably can't read it, but béchamel, velouté, the things we know. But you'll note there are many global influences in here too. Hollandaise from Holland, Espagnol from Spain, Milanese, Bolognese from Italy, Maltaise from Malta. But of course, all of them were transformed or cooked in the Lévi-Strauss sense by this system into something completely French. A Spanish person recognizing an Espagnol sauce would be unheard of, even today. So a question that I ask myself is, do you have to chart something or find a system in order for it to exist? Obviously, if you're French, maybe that's true. If you're American, I don't think we work that way. So is there an American cuisine? Whereas it's easy to find American food around the world, we already said you can find a Kentucky Fried Chicken or a McDonald's or maybe soon a Shake Shack. Can you find American cuisine? Again, here's where the problem exists, because if the word cuisine doesn't apply and you can't really define it because it looks like all these other cuisines, what is it that you're even looking for? How do you know when you see it? Hasn't stopped people from looking for cuisines not just in America, but all over the world, ever since the time of Escoffier. Italy has been trying to force its food into some system. China has been trying to find the way that one cuisine relates to another. But I would suggest it's really a French problem. Is there an American cuisine? Well, we've got pie. These are Thibault's beautiful pies. I want to own one of these paintings one day. It's an aspiration. And pie I'm using as a surrogate for all of the traditional dishes we have. Many of them are regional, and if you travel around the country, you see them from time to time. They're even undergoing a resurgence in popularity among young chefs today. I'm talking about the baked beans I showed, or the macaroni and cheese, but also Cincinnati chili and crawfish gumbo and huckleberry grunts and the sorts of things that James Beard loved. These dishes may have once been tied to our geography and our culture and our local communities or a sense of place, like old world cuisines. But like many Americans, they gave up their roots to become modern. In fact, giving up their roots was part of becoming American, I think. James Beard wrote this book, looks a little bit different from Escoffier's, called American Cookery in 1972. Some people consider it a seminal work, although it wasn't his most popular book. But it's interesting to note that he called it cookery, not cuisine. He would have been laughed out of the publisher's office to think about cuisine. It's really a compendium of dishes from around the country, old and new. Many of them he didn't even like. I love the sense that he wrote some headnotes and said, this is a lousy dish, but here's the recipe. You can't do that today. But really, I mean, you think of this more as a recipe box, not a diagram or a system or some perspective, some inner workings of a whole cuisine. So it's not this, the sockles, Carême sockles, it's this, it's pie. Very different, but no less important, just harder to find, harder to understand. And I would argue that when you put all of these things together through the magic of this sort of technology, and you come out with a hamburger, that it's no wonder that this hamburger is the thing that sticks. This is the thing, eating with our hands, eating this idea of a capitalist, global, marketed food that is about as American as anything you can imagine. Doesn't mean it isn't important. Doesn't mean American food isn't delicious. And it doesn't mean it's all about hamburgers. It just means this is the thing that's easy to spot. So if you look at the country, and this is a map, again, I apologize, the resolution's not so great, but these are some old dishes that places are known for. Crawfish in New Orleans, sourdough bread in San Francisco, key lime pie in Florida, lobsters in Maine. Things that are certainly recipes for them are in James Beard's book without a diagram and a chart and a system. And you superimpose on this what's going on in food today in dynamic communities across the country, whether Portland, which was, it's hard to read, Portland, which is up there, which was where Beard was from in the West, or Portland in the East in Maine, another great community, or Oakland, or Charleston. You'll have to trust me that these words are on there, or Austin, and Seattle, and Chicago, and Philly, and Nashville, and everywhere Beard could never imagine there'd be dynamic restaurant communities. And then, of course, we can't leave out Brooklyn. Well, where is Brooklyn? There's Brooklyn, which has become the center of, or at least the brand of this modern American urban culinary renaissance. I think it's this dynamism and excitement about what is happening in America that we see around the world and that we brought with us to the World's Fair last year. This is the USA Pavilion in Milan, and I think in the dark here I spot someone who was working there with me who opened this conference last year, Dorothy Hamilton in the corner. Together we created this idea of American Food 2.0 as the theme of the pavilion, which was meant to suggest that although you know us as a nation of hamburger and hot dog lovers, and we serve plenty of hamburgers and hot dogs, as I said, call that American Food 1.0 or 1.5, we have had a tremendous evolution, even a revolution in food in America, and we wanted to tell the world about it. But again, how do you tell the world if it isn't easy to identify, if it doesn't form a neat package, if it isn't a cuisine? Well, I'm going to bring James Beard back here because Beard wrote an essay in 1983, just 2 years before he died, 10 years after he wrote American Cookery, and I think he gave us something that is helpful for us to understand. He said there may not be an American food, and he warned people not to get excited about this new American cuisine, which in the 80s, 70s and 80s was all the rage in the United States. But he talked about an American attitude toward food. And I think it's an attitude about food, rather than a cuisine, that is something that we can rightly claim. After all, we're a country with a lot of attitude. Just watch the debates last night, or listen to all of that nonsense going on over there in the political space. But now we have to figure out what that attitude is. Like many amorphous things, I think it might be easier to claim we know it when we see it, or perhaps what it isn't, what an attitude isn't. So what is American food? What isn't American food? This is not American food. This is not an American attitude toward food. This is the dining room of the Maurice in Paris. A beautiful room, a wonderful restaurant, and about as French gets. This is the attitude about food that the French exported around the world through guys like Carême and Escoffier and the people who came after them. And just to give you a sense of how this was exported around the world, here is Gordon Ramsay at the Connaught in London. Here is Jean-Georges in New York. Obviously, this is an American restaurant. It's in America, but it looks a little French to me. And just to make that point, here are Jean-Georges' asparagus. They look kind of French to me, asparagus and morels. Doesn't mean they're not delicious, but could we claim them? Could we bring those to a restaurant in Milan and say, this is American food? Probably not. Instead, let's go back to Brooklyn. This looks a little different. This is, of course, the dining room at Roberta's. And this is the thing that we're seeing around the world. Roberta's is a do-it-yourself kind of place. Just build it, just grow it, just cook it, and they will come. And if they don't come, fuck them. That's the attitude. Roberta's was a pizzeria, well, really a pizza oven. Now that pizzeria includes a garden, a bread bakery, a takeout shop, trucks that go around the city, and, of course, a very fine degustation restaurant that can rival any of the world's 50 best. The do-it-yourself with your own rules attitude doesn't mean it isn't serious or sophisticated. It doesn't mean it isn't delicious or ethically mindful. Quite the reverse, actually. Brooklyn has come to stand for a celebration of artisanship, of flavor, of sustainability, of mindfulness, of a can-do attitude that I'm seeing all over the world. And it looks surprisingly similar from place to place. Here it is in Oakland, California, at Camino, which I know you'll say is just down the street from where this all began at Chez Panisse, and you wouldn't be wrong, especially because the chef and owner, Russell, of Camino worked at Chez Panisse for 20 years. But the idealism of Chez Panisse has now been seasoned with that gritty urbanism of Brooklyn, and that's the combination that's resonating with young chefs in cities and restaurants around the world. Here it is in Milan, in fact, at Un Posto a Milano, not really a ristorante or a trattoria in any traditional sense, but a restaurant in the Brooklyn, Oakland, Portland model that even comes with poetry readings, and they give you a manifesto when you sit down. Here it is in Tokyo at Brooklyn Parlor, which in the true Japanese tradition is almost more Brooklyn or better Brooklyn than Brooklyn itself. But back to Brooklyn. Here are what vegetables look like at Roberta's. This is their carrot salad. I had lunch there with my cousin earlier this year. It might look messy and unkempt, but of course we know it's not. It's completely deliberate and completely delicious. And emblematic, I think, of the vegetable-focused cooking we see on menus around this city and we see on menus around the world. And these carrots, of course, couldn't be more different than those asparagus. I mean, I'm not talking about their deliciousness, but I'm talking about this American attitude toward food. Something different is happening. And there's no better signal, I think, of the cultural culinary tables turning than the theme of the most recent cultural festival at Paris's famed Bon Marché department store. You guessed it, Brooklyn, Rive Gauche, the Frenchest Brooklyn you've ever seen. To me, I find the whole thing, this juxtaposition of Brooklyn toques lined up like Jean-Georges' asparagus is one of the funniest, these are the Frenchest hipster hats that I know. And of course, Bon Marché knew they couldn't have Brooklyn without pickles and artisanal distillates and such. The American culinary revolution has come full circle back to France. The thing is, just as Carême and Escoffier were interested in more than simply taste, they were interested in the role of the chef, the representation of French nationality. They were interested even in cultural patrimony, as Escoffier's memoir quote reminds us, this new American attitude toward food is more than just aesthetic or gastronomic. It has the look and feel and flavor of a different set of values, thanks to Chez Panisse, certainly, and all of the chefs and restaurants that came before and have come since. But the current American attitude toward food incorporates the concepts of sustainability, the seasonality and regionality of food and its aesthetic, that can-do attitude. I mean, you could call it, in some ways, food system food. I know that that's nonsensical in part, but actually I think it's really at the core of what we're talking about. The American attitude toward food our best chefs are exporting today is about how to cook with the sort of mindfulness that leads to the best solutions for food for everyone, how to cook consciously within while changing the food system, and it is absolutely delicious. As a demonstration of what might be the only truly American art form, and if you'll forgive me, that's marketing, we find ourselves selling these ideas around the world, not quite like this faux campaign Sarah Brito of Chefs Collaborative created for the New York Times to try to underscore the role that kale has in this new food attitude, this new food movement, and give broccoli a chance of the love that kale has gotten from American Food 2.0, but you get the picture. So while we continue to celebrate the regionality of American food with dishes and chefs and flavors that resonate, this is the regional room in the exhibits at the World's Fair where we sent a photographer around the country to photograph those in American classics restaurants proudly displaying their stuff. While we continue to celebrate this, we can also celebrate the incredible talent of American chefs of the highest order. This is an amazing interpretation of tomato, mozzarella, and basil insalata caprese by Grant Achatz of Alinea, a redefinition of Italian-American food, if ever there was one. And it all comes back to me, at least this attitude, I think, to an openness, an optimism, and an innovation that is about as American as apple pie. Here James Beard is displaying proudly one of his creations. Thank you very much. Enjoy.